Our Lady of the Flowers by Genet, page 261. The darling block walks with little swaying steps. He is alone in his cell. From his nostrils, he plucks acacia and violet petals. With his back to the door where an anonymous eye is always spying, he eats them. And with the back of his thumb, where he has let the nail grow long like that of a scholar, he hunts for others. Darling is a fake pimp. The schemes he devises suddenly peter out in poetical meanderings. Almost always he walks with a regular and casual step. He is haunted by a memory. Today he is pacing to and fro in his cell. He is unoccupied, which is very rare, for he almost constantly is at work in secret, but with fidelity to his curse. He goes to the shelf and raises his hand to the level where, in the garret, on a piece of furniture, the revolver lies. The door opens with a great rattling, as of locks being forged, and the guard yells out, "Quick, the towels!" Darling stands there, rooted, holding in his hands the clean towels he has been given for the dirty ones. Then he continues by fits and starts the gestures of the drama which he is unaware he is acting out. He sits down on his bed. He rubs his hand over his forehead. He hesitates. Finally, he gets up, and in front of the little 2-penny mirror nailed to the wall, he pushes aside his blonde hair and, without realizing what he is doing, looks for a bullet wound at his temple. Night unlooses Darling from his tough rind of determined pimp. In his sleep, he grows tender, but all he can do is clutch at the pillow, cling to it, lay his cheek tenderly on the rough cloth, the cheek of a kid about to burst into tears, and say, "Stay, please, my love, stay." In the hearts of all the men is enacted a 5-second tragedy in verse. Conflicts, cries, daggers, or prison, which resolves. The liberated man has just been the witness and matter of a poetic work. For a long time, I thought that the poetic work posed conflicts. It cancels them. At the foot of the prison walls, the wind is kneeling. The prison draws along all the cells where the prisoners are asleep, grows lighter, and slips away. Rum, censers, the thieves are far. The second-story men are mounting. By stairwell or elevator, subtly they spirit away. They steal and steal away. On the landing, the midnight bourgeois, overwhelmed by the dread of the mystery of a child who steals, of an adolescent jimmying doors. The raw bourgeois dares not cry out, "Stop, thief!" He hardly turns his head. The thief makes heads turn. Houses pitch. Castles dance. Prisons fly. Darling is asleep at the foot of the bed. Sleep, darling, stealer of nothing, stealer of books, of bell ropes, of horses' manes and tails, of bikes, of fancy dogs. Darling, tricky darling, who can rob women of their compacts and with a limed stick, priests of the money in the collection box. The devout taking communion at low mass of the bags they leave on the prayer stool, the pimps of their beat, the police of their inside tips, concierges of their sons or daughters. Sleep, sleep, hardly has the day dawned when a ray on your blonde hair of the oncoming sun locks you in your prison. And the days that follow make your life longer than broad. When it is time to get up, a prisoner runs all the way around the balcony and bangs once on each door. one after the other, with the same gestures. 3,000 prisoners disturb the heavy atmosphere, get up, and do the little morning jobs. Later, a guard will open the grate of cell 329 to hand out the soup. He looks and doesn't say a word. In this story, the guards also have their job. They are not all fools, but they are all purely indifferent to the game they play. They haven't the slightest notion of the beauty of their function. Recently, they have been wearing a dark blue uniform, which is an exact copy of aviators' outfits, and I think, if they are high-minded, that they are ashamed of being caricatures of heroes. They are aviators, fallen from the sky, smashing the glass of the ceiling. They have escaped into prison. On their collars, there still cling stars, which, from close up, seem white and embroidered, because it is daytime when we can see them. One imagines that they threw themselves from their planes in terror. The wounded child, Gunnermeyer, fell curled with fear. He fell with his wings shattered by the hard air it had to cleave, his body bleeding a benzene rainbow, and that is what is meant by falling into a heaven of glory. They are at last in a world which does not surprise them. They have the right to walk by the cells without opening them, to look at the humble, gentle-hearted hoodlums. No, they do not think of doing so because they have no desire to. They fly in the air. They have no desire to open the gates, and, through the diamond-shaped opening, take by surprise the familiar gestures of murderers and thieves. Take them by surprise when they are washing their linen, tucking in their bedclothes for the night, sealing their windows as a matter of good housekeeping, with their big fingers and a pin, slitting matches in 2 or in 4, and to make a trivial, hence human, remark to them, to see whether they are not transformed at once into lynxes or foxes. They are guardians of tombs. They open the doors and shut them again, unconcerned about the treasures they protect. They're honest. Beware of the word noble and the word honest, which I have just used. Their honest faces, pulled downward, smoothed by the vertical fall without parachutes, are not altered by rubbing shoulders with racketeers, crooks, pimps, fences, forgers, killers, and counterfeiters. Not a flower bespatters their uniform, not a crease of dubious elegance. And if I could say of one of them that he walked on velvet feet, it was because a few days later he was to betray, to go over to the opposite camp, which is the thieving camp, to go straight back up into the sky, with the cash box under his armpit. I had noticed him at Mass in the chapel. At the moment of communion, the chaplain left the altar and went up to one of the first cells, for the chapel is also divided into 500 cells, standing coffins, carrying the host to a prisoner who was supposed to wait for it on bended knees. Hence this turnkey, who, wearing his cap, was in a corner of the altar platform, with his hands in his pockets, his legs spread, in short, assuming the posture in which I so enjoyed seeing Alberto again, smiled, but in a pleasantly amused way, which I would never have thought possible in a turnkey. His smile accompanied the Eucharist and the return of the empty ciborium, and I thought that while rubbing his balls with his left hand, he was jeering at the worshipper. I had already wondered what would become of the meeting of a handsome young guard and a handsome young criminal. I took delight in the following 2 images: a bloody and mortal shock, or a sparkling embrace in a riot of spunk and panting. But I had never taken special notice of any guard until I finally saw him. From my cell, which was the last in the row, I could hardly make out his features, and so I was able to give him those of a young, cowardly Mexican half-breed, whose face I had cut out of the cover of an adventure novel. I thought, you little rat, I'll give you a communion all right. My hatred and horror of that breed must have given me a still stiffer heart-on, for I felt my tool swelling under my fingers, and I shook it until finally, without taking my eyes off the guard, who was still smiling pleasantly. I can tell myself now that he was smiling at another guard, or at a murderer, and that, since I was between them, his luminous smile passed through me and decomposed me. I could believe the turnkey was vanquished and grateful. In the presence of the guards, Darling felt like a little boy. He hated and respected them. All day long he smokes until he rocks on his bed. In his nausea, light spots form islands. The gesture of a mistress, the face smooth and beardless as a boxer's of a girl. He flings his butts away for the pleasure of the gesture. One can expect anything of a pimp who rolls his cigarettes because this gives his fingers a certain elegance, who wears crepe-soled shoes so as to take the people he passes by surprise, people who will look at him with more astonishment, will see his tie, will envy his hips, his shoulders, the back of his neck, who, without knowing him, will create for him, despite his incognito, from one passer-by to the next, a procession strewn and interrupted with homage, will accord a discontinuous and momentary sovereignty to this stranger. And the result of all these moments of sovereignty will be that, all the same, he will, at the end of his days, have gone through life like a sovereign. In the evening, he gathers up the scattered tobacco and smokes it. Lying in bed on his back with his legs spread, he flicks the cigarette ash with his right hand. His left hand is under his head. In a moment of happiness, made up of Darling's delightful aptitude for being that which, by virtue of his pose, is profoundly that, and which this essential quality makes live again there with its true life. Lying on a hard bed and smoking, what could he be? Darling will never suffer, or will always be able to get out of a tight spot by his ease and taking on the gestures of some fellow he admires, who happens to be in the same situation. And if books or anecdotes do not provide him with any, in creating them. Thus, his desires, but he realized it too late, when there was no longer time to recede, were neither the desire to be a smuggler, king, juggler, explorer, or slave trader, but the desire to be one of the smugglers, one of the kings, jugglers, etc. That is, as if, in the most woeful of postures, Darling will be able to remember it was also that of one of his gods. And if they never assumed it, he'll force them to have assumed it, and his own posture will be sacred, and thereby even better than merely bearable. In this way he is like me, who create those men, weedmen, pilors, socali, in my desire to be them. But he is quite unlike me in his faithfulness to his characters, for I have long since resigned myself to being myself. But the fact is that my longing for a splendid imaginary destiny has, as it were, condensed the tragic purple elements of my actual life into a kind of extremely compact, solid, and scintillating reduction. And I sometimes have the complex face of divine, who is herself, first and at times simultaneously, in her features and gestures, the imaginary and yet so real creatures of election, with whom, in strict privacy, she has contentions, who torture and exalt her, but who allow her no rest, and give her by subtle contractions of wrinkles and the quiverings of her fingers that disquieting air of being multiple. For she remains silent, as shut as a tomb, and like a tomb, peopled by the unclean. Lying on a hard bed and smoking, what could he be? That which by virtue of his pose is most profoundly that is, a jailed pimp smoking a cigarette, that is himself. You will therefore understand to what degree Divine's inner life was different than Darling's inner life. Darling has written Divine a letter, on the envelope of which he is obliged to put Monsieur, and has also written one to Our Lady of the Flowers. Divine is in the hospital. She sends a money order of 500 francs. We shall read his letter later on. Our Lady has not answered. A guard opens the door and pushes a newcomer into the cell. Is it I or Darling who will receive him? He brings with him his blankets, mess tin, cup, wooden spoon, and his story. At his first words, I stop him. He keeps on talking, but I am no longer there. What's your name? Jean. That's enough. Like me and like the dead child for whom I am writing, his name is Jean. Besides, what would it matter if he were less handsome? But I have a run of bad luck. Jean there, Jean here. When I tell one of them that I love him, I wonder whether I am not telling it to myself. I am no longer here because I am again trying to relive the few times he let me caress him. I dared all, and in order to tame him, I allowed him to have the superiority of the male over me. His member was as solid as a man's, and his adolescent's face was a gentleness itself, so that when lying on my bed in my room, straight and motionless, he discharged into my mouth. He lost nothing of his virginal chastity. It is another Jean here who is telling me his story. I am no longer alone, but I am thereby more alone than ever. I mean that the solitude of prison gave me the freedom to be with the 100 Jean Genets glimpsed in 100 passers-by. For I am quite like Darling, who also stole the darlings whom a thoughtless gesture let escape from all the strangers he had brushed against. But the new Jean brings into me, as a folding fan draws in the designs on the gauze, brings in I know not what. Yet he is far from unlikable. He is even stupid enough for me to feel a certain tenderness for him. His narrow eyes, brown skin, bushy hair, and that wide-awake look, something like a Greek hooligan whom one pictures crouching at the foot of the invisible statue of Mercury, playing the game of goose, but keeping an eye on the god in order to steal his sandals. What are you in for? Pimping. They call me the Pigalle Weasel. Don't hand me that. You're not dressed for it. At Pigalle, there's only fairies. Let's hear it. The Greek child tells me that he was caught in the act just as he was removing his hand, which was stuffed with bills, from the cast drawer of a bar. But I'll get even. When I get out, I'm gonna bust all his windows with stones at night. But I'm gonna put on gloves to pick up the stones with because of the fingerprints. Can't muck around with me. I continue my reading of cheap novels. It satisfies my love of hoodlums, dressed up as gentlemen. Also my taste for imposture, my taste for the sham. which could very well make me write on my visiting cards, Jean Genet, bogus Count of Tillancourt. Amidst the pages of these thick books, in flattened type, marvels appear. Like straight lilies there surge up young men, who are, thanks in part to me, both princes and beggars. If from myself I make divine, from them I make her lovers, Our Lady, darling, Gabriel, Alberto, lads who whistle through their teeth, and on whose heads you can, if you look closely, see, in the form of an aureole, a royal crown. I cannot prevent them from having the nostalgic quality of cheap novels with paper as grey as the skies of Venice and London, all marked up with the drawings and fierce signs of convicts, profiles with eyes and full face, bleeding hearts. I read these works which are idiotic to the sense of reason, but my reason is not concerned with a book from which poisoned, feathered phrases swoop down on me. The hand that launches them sketches, as it nails them somewhere, the dim outline of a Jean who recognizes himself, dares not move, awaiting the one that aimed at his heart in earnest will leave him, panting. I am madly in love, as I love prison, with that close print, compact as a pile of rubbish, crammed with acts as bloody as linens as the fetuses of dead cats, and I do not know whether it is stiffly erect pricks which are transformed into tough knights, or knights into vertical pricks. And after all, is it necessary for me to talk about myself so directly? I much prefer to describe myself in the caresses I reserve for my lovers. The new Jean came very close to becoming darling. What did he lack? When he farts, with a sharp noise, he makes that gesture of bending on his thighs while keeping his hands in his pockets and turning his torso a little as though he were screwing it up. It is the movement of a pilot at the helm, and he is the image of darling, about whom I liked, among other things, the following. When he hummed a Java tune, he would do a dance step and place both hands in front of him, as if they were holding the waist of a partner. Depending on his mood, he made the waist more or less narrow, drawing his always mobile hands apart or together. He therefore seemed also to be holding the sensitive steering wheel of a delage on an almost straight road. He also seemed to be a nervous boxer, protecting his liver with flat, agile hands, thus. The same gesture was common to a number of heroes, whom darling suddenly became, and it always so happened that this gesture was the one that symbolized most forcefully the most graceful of males. He would make those marvelous gestures which bring us to their knees, tough gestures that spur us on and make us whimper, like that city whose flanks I saw bleeding streams of statues on the march, advancing to a rhythm of statues borne up by sleep. The battalions advance in their dreams through the streets like a flying carpet, or like a tire which falls and rebounds with a slow, heavy rhythm. Their feet stumble in the clouds, then they awake. But an officer says a word, they close their eyes and go on in their sleep, on their boots, which are as heavy as pedestals, the dust being a cloud. Like the darlings who have passed through us, far away on their clouds, the one thing that makes them different is their steely hips, which can never make crooked, flexible pimps of them. It amazes me that Horst Wessel, the pander, which he was said to be, gave birth to a legend and a ballad. Mindless, fecundating as a golden powder, they fell on Paris, which for one whole night repressed the beating of its heart. As for us, we shudder in ourselves, which sing or complain with forced voluptuousness. For merely suspecting that debauch of males, we are as excited as if we saw a giant standing with his legs spread and with a heart on. Darling had been in the jug about 3 months. At the time, I met the miners whose faces seemed to be so willful, so hard, though so young, making my poor white flesh, in which I no longer see anything of the fierce colonists of Mettray, appear flabby. But I do recognize them and fear them. He went downstairs for a medical examination. There, a youngster spoke to him about Our Lady of the Flowers. Everything that I tell you here, in straightforward fashion, Darling learned in bits and scraps, through words whispered behind a hand spread, fan-wise, in the course of a number of medical examinations. Throughout his astounding life, Darling, who is up on everything, will never know anything, just as he will always be ignorant of the fact that Our Lady is his son, so that he will not know that in the story the kid tells him, Pierrot the Corsican is Our Lady, under a nickname he used for peddling dope. So, Our Lady was at the home of the kid who is going to talk, when the elevator of the building stopped at the landing. The sound of it stopping marked the moment from which the inevitable must be assumed. An elevator that stops quickens the heartbeat of the one who hears it, like the sound of nails being hammered in the distance. It makes life as brittle as glass. Someone rang. The sound of the bell was less fatal than that of the elevator. It restored a bit of certainty of the accepted. If the kid and Our Lady had heard nothing more after the sound of the elevator, they would have died of fright. It was the kid who opened the door. "Police," said one of the men, making the familiar gesture of turning back his lapel. At present, the image of fatality is for me the triangle formed by 3 men, too ordinary looking not to be dangerous. Imagine that I am walking up a street. All 3 of them are on the left-hand sidewalk, where I have not yet noticed them, but they have seen me. One of them crosses over to the right side of the street. The second stays on the left, and the last slackens his pace and forms the apex of the triangle in which I am about to be enclosed. It's the police. "Police." They stepped into the anteroom. The whole floor was covered with a rug. Anyone who is willing to mix detective story adventures into his daily life, a life of shoes to be laced, buttons to sew on, blackheads to remove, has to be a bit fey himself. The detectives walked with one hand on the cocked revolvers in their jacket pockets. At the other end of the kid's studio apartment, the mantelpiece was topped by a huge mirror, framed in rocaille cristal, with complicated facets. A few chairs upholstered in yellow silk were scattered about. The curtains were drawn. The artificial light came from a small chandelier. It was noon. The detectives smelled crime, and they were right, for the studio reproduced the stuffy atmosphere in which our panting lady, his gestures caught in a form stiff with courtesy and fear, had strangled the old man. There were roses and arum on the mantelpiece, in front of them. As in the old man's apartment, the varnished furniture was all curves, from which the light seemed to well up rather than settle, as on the globes of grapes. The detectives moved forward, and Our Lady watched them move forward, in a silence as fearful as the eternal silence of unknown space. They were moving forward, as was he himself then, in eternity. They came at just the right moment, in the middle of the studio. On a big table, a big, naked body lay flat on the red velvet cover. Our Lady of the Flowers, who was standing attentively beside the table, watched the detectives approach. At the same time that the ominous idea of a murder occurred to them, the idea that this murder was sham destroyed the murder. The awkwardness of such a proposition, the awkwardness of its being both absurd and possible, of its being a sham murder, made the detectives feel uneasy. It was quite obvious that they could not have been in the presence of the dismembering of a murdered man or woman. The detectives were wearing signet rings of real gold, and their neckties had genuine knots. As soon as, and before, they got to the edge of the table, they saw clearly that the corpse was a tailor's wax dummy. Nevertheless, the idea of murder clouded the simple data of the problem. "You there, I don't like your looks." The eldest of the detectives said this to Our Lady, because the face of Our Lady of the Flowers is so radiantly pure that the idea immediately occurred to everyone that it was false, that this angel must be two-faced, with flames and smoke. For everyone has had occasion to say at least once in his life, "You'd have thought he was a true saint," and wants at all costs to be foxier than destiny. So, a sham murder dominated the scene. The two detectives were merely after the cocaine that one of the stool pigeons had tracked down to the kid's place. "Hand over the coke and make it snappy." "We don't have any coke, Chief." "Come on, kids, make it snappy, otherwise we'll take you in and search the premises. That won't help you any." The kid hesitated a second, 3 seconds. He knew the ways of detectives, and he knew he was caught. He made up his mind. "Here, that's all we have." He held out a tiny packet, folded like a packet of pharmaceutical powder, which he removed from the case of his wristwatch. The detective pocketed it, his vest pocket. "What about him?" "He don't have any. Honest, Chief, you can search." "And what about that? Where does that come from?" The dummy. Here we must perhaps recognize Divine's influence. She is present wherever the inexplicable arises. She, the giddy one, strews traps in her wake, artful pitfalls, deep dungeon cells, even at the risk of being caught in them herself, if she does an about-face. And because of her, the minds of Darling, Our Lady, and their cronies bristle with ridiculous gestures. With their heads high, they take falls that doom them to the worst of fates. Our Lady's young friend was also a crook. And one night, he and Our Lady of the Flowers stole a cardboard box from a parked car. When they opened it, they found it full of the frightful pieces of a wax dummy that had been dissembled. The cops were putting on their overcoats. They didn't answer. The roses on the mantelpiece were lovely, heavy, and excessively fragrant. This further unsteadied the detectives. The murder was fake or unfinished. They had come looking for dope. Dope, laboratories set up in garret rooms which explode. Wreckage. Does that mean cocaine is dangerous? They took the 2 young men to the vice squad, and that same evening they went back with the commissioner to make a search that yielded 300 grams of cocaine, which did not mean they left the kid and Our Lady in peace. The detectives did all they could to get as much information out of them as possible. They fired questions at them, searched through the darkness to unravel a few threads that might lead to other seizures. They subjected them to modern torture, kicks in the belly, slaps, rulers in the ribs, and various other games, first one and then the other. "Confess!" they screamed. Finally, Our Lady rolled under a table. Wild with rage, a detective dashed at him, but a second detective held him back by the arm, mumbled something to him, and then said aloud, "Let him go. Come on, Gobert. After all, he hasn't committed a crime." "Him? With that baby doll mug of his? He's capable of it, all right." Trembling with fear, Our Lady came out from under the table. They made him sit down on a chair, and after all, it was only a cocaine offense, and in the adjoining room, the other kid was being treated less roughly. The officer who had stopped the game of massacre remained alone with Our Lady. He sat down and offered him a cigarette. "Tell me what you know. No great harm done. Just a couple of grams of dope. You're not going to get the guillotine." It will be very difficult for me to explain precisely and describe minutely what took place inside Our Lady of the Flowers. It is hardly possible to speak in this connection of gratitude toward the more soft-spoken of the detectives. The easing of the strain that Our Lady felt as a result of the phrase, "There's not much harm done." No, it's not quite that. The detective said, "The thing that got him sore was your dummy." He laughed and inhaled a mouthful of smoke, gargled it. Did Our Lady fear a lesser punishment? First, there came from his liver, right up against his teeth, the confession of the old man's murder. He didn't make the confession, but the confession was rising, rising. If he opens his mouth, he'll blurt it all out. He felt he was lost. Suddenly he gets dizzy. He sees himself on the pediment of a not very high temple. "I'm 18. I can be sentenced to death." He thinks very quickly. If he loosens his fingers, he falls. Come, he pulls himself together. No, he won't say anything. It would be magnificent to say it. It would be glorious. No, 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 Lord, no. He's saved. The confession withdraws without having crossed. "I killed an old man. Our Lady has fallen from the pediment of the temple, and instantly slack despair lulls him to sleep. He is rested. The detective has hardly moved." "Who? What old man?" Our Lady comes back to life. He laughs. "No, I'm kidding. I was just joking." With dizzying speed, he concocts the following alibi. A murderer confesses spontaneously and in an idiotic way, with impossible details, to a murder so that they'll think he's crazy and stop suspecting him. Wasted effort.